Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anthony Knight, and I'm the president and founder of the Baton Foundation. I guess I have my amen section down here. Thank you all for coming, and for those who are new to the Baton Foundation and to our programming, we started 4 years ago now. It's really hard to believe. 2015, we incorporated and started programming in 2016. And we started primarily to help educate black boys about black history and culture. But we understood early on that we could not educate black boys without making some kind of effort to educate those in our community. So that is the genesis of having programming. And we've had a wonderful partner in our programming, the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Whenever we give them our list of things we'd like to do, I've not yet heard no. So we thank Ruben and Morris and the other staff who really help make these programs possible. Before we get started, I'd like to ask that you silence or turn off your cell phone so that this afternoon's lecture is not interrupted. Thank you. So today we're here to hear a lecture about the summer of 1919. It is 100 years later. And I thought it might be interesting and to kind of look back 100 years and see what that summer was about, but also to connect that summer to our current history. And so I, as I always do, reach out to folks cold. And Cam was a very willing participant when I reached out to him. So I'm really grateful to Cam McWhirter for making himself available today to talk about his book, to talk about why he decided to write the book, and also to make some connections between the summer of 1919 and the year 2019. So the book is available. If you've not noticed before you came in, the book is available, and I was informed that with tax it comes to $21. So I encourage you to purchase the book, learn more about the summer of 1919 and that history. Of course, Cam won't be able to tell you everything today. So purchase the book. And Acapella Books, our book vendor partner, always donates a portion of their proceeds to the Baton Foundation. So purchase a book, support Cam, support us, and have some really valuable information in your library. So Cameron McWhirter is a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal based in Atlanta. He covers politics, economics, breaking news, and other subjects. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude from Hamilton College, where he majored in history, and he earned a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Prior to joining the Journal in 2010, he worked for several news organizations, including the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Detroit News, reporting in various cities across the United States, as well as in Bosnia, Iraq, Costa Rica, and other countries. He has been awarded a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship for Research in Eritrea and the Sudan, and a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University. Cam is the author of Red Summer, The Summer of 1919, and The Awakening of Black America, published by Henry Holt in 2011. Cam lives in Decatur, Georgia, with his wife, 2 children, 2 dogs, 2 rabbits, a cat, and 2 beehives. I think he likes animals. Please join me in welcoming Cam McWhirter.
Hey, thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. We now have 3 beehives, so just they split and we got an extra one. But I wanted to, first of all, Anthony's organization is great. I think it's fantastic that that's being, what he's trying to do with that organization is fantastic. We had a conversation briefly earlier. One of the things that I really want to hammer home, and I think everyone should really understand, is that American history is, if you don't understand race and in American history, you don't understand American history. You don't get it. So I was listening to my biography, and I sound super white, like a white, like I should be walking around like I just walked off the Mayflower. But and I'm not passing, I am white. But my point is, you know, why would a white guy spend 3 years writing a book about this horribly ugly subject in American history? Because it's important, because you don't understand American history if you don't understand race and its role in American history. So that's why I wrote the book. That's why no one else was. I stumbled upon this while I was at Harvard, and I was fascinated for a long time about racial violence. When I was in Bosnia, everybody in Bosnia looked the same. The same. But the suffix of their last name would indicate whether they had been a Muslim in the past. I mean, everybody was basically a socialist in Sarajevo, but whether they had been a Muslim or a Serb or a Croat, and they started killing each other in a way that people were still stupefied that could happen. And then I started, every city wherever I worked, there'd be, I was always interested in the history of wherever I was, and if you study, you don't have to scratch the surface too far, and there was a race riot in the city where I worked. So Atlanta, 1906, massive race riot. You had race riots in Chicago, Detroit, New York. And so I started researching that violence and how that could occur and what people did to try to stop it. And as you do that, 1919 jumps up pretty quickly as by far the worst spasm of racial violence in American history. So that's why I wrote the book. And I appreciate you guys coming here to hear about it. And I'll try not to jaw on too long about it. And of course, any questions at the end, please, I'll talk to you ad nauseum about this. I want to start with a poem people might know. It's called If We Must Die by Claude McKay, who was a young Caribbean American railroad porter in 1919. And he was terrified because every time he would go to another town and the door would open, the railroad car would open up, he and his colleagues didn't know if there was going to be a race riot because they were reading the newspapers. There was no radio or television at the time. And every newspaper, there'd be screaming headlines about race riots in 1919 as it unfolded. And so one day he snuck into the bathroom of a railroad car and he scrawled out this sonnet called If We Must Die. And I'm going to read a section of it. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave, like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. Now, the whole sonnet never mentions race, doesn't mention it at all, but he read that poem to the other porters in the car, and some of them started crying. He mailed it off to a little magazine in New York, which published it, and then African-American publications all over the country started publishing it, and everybody knew what it was about. And white politicians stood up and said, "This is seditious, this is communism." They attacked this poem. And he wrote it, and it became to really embody the Red Summer. So the Red Summer, and I'm going to go into some of this, it was a very ugly time with lots of violence against primarily African-American individuals and African-American communities. But it's also an amazing story of fighting back. And that means literally fighting back in the streets. It also means politically mobilizing, starting to take political action on a level that African Americans had not done, I would argue, even before Reconstruction. Reconstruction was, there was amazing political activity at that time, but what happened in 1919 was astounding with the NAACP and other organizations. But you also had, so there was fighting back in the courts. There was a big explosion of interest in African-American culture, which led very shortly thereafter to the Harlem Renaissance. So it really was it's a story of incredible efforts to suppress African-Americans and then an incredible response to that, which I would argue began the long civil rights movement. And so this is, I argue, a quintessentially American story of people establishing their place in American society, and it certainly wasn't easy. And you can make long and strong arguments for why that hasn't been completed to this day, but they staked their flag in the ground. And I want to show, although I'm technologically a little bit of an idiot, but here. So this is a map of some of the major incidents that took place that year. And I'll point out all the ones that were started by black people. None of those math. Zero. That would be zero. So these were all, now these are, oh, why did it do that? But these were, some of these would probably be people would sort of expect, right? South Georgia, Charleston, Mississippi. Everyone's going to think, oh, okay. But San Francisco, Bisbee, Arizona, Omaha, Nebraska, Chicago, up in New London, Connecticut. I mean, it was all over. And I grew up in Chicago, outside of Chicago, and I have lived down here since 2003. And there is a lot of prejudice down here that still exists, and racism that certainly has to be dealt with. But I find that the people that I know in the North still, they have this attitude that, oh, the South, that's where there's racism. And I have to constantly reiterate to them, that's not really the story, because it's pretty much all over the country. And certainly this, in 1919, the riots in Chicago, I would argue, were probably the worst of the year. Washington, D.C. was probably second. All right, so I'm going to start with, 1919, let's talk about that year. We had just won the war. World War I had ended in 1918 with the armistice. Woodrow Wilson was this hero, declaring that he's going to help create a League of Nations in which America would be a primary partner, and it would be peace in our time. We'll never have an ugly war like this. We just, kicked the ass of all these imperial armies. We are triumphant. We are America. And so you'd think it would be this great period in American history, and everything would be hunky-dory, people would be waving flags. In fact, it was a period of great anxiety. There was, the communists had taken over the Soviet Union, anarchists and communists and other radicals were delivering bombs around America to politicians. There were a huge number of strikes taking place. There was influenza was still cruising around the entire planet, killing lots and millions of people. There was tremendous economic problems. They called it HCE, for high cost of living, but it was basically inflation was going nuts. All these soldiers were returning in a lot of places, and they couldn't find work. So it was just a period of great tension. I found a political cartoon that someone did for that year, and it was the globe sitting in bed biting his nails while all these concerns flew around their head. And it was a period of terrible tension. And into that, there were three great things happening for African Americans that year. And so that should be good, right? One thing that was really good was black soldiers had gone over to fight in World War I. Maybe people here have heard of the Hellfighters. They had served very bravely in France, but hundreds, tens of thousands of other African Americans had served in France. When they arrived there, they were treated tremendously by the French people, who were thrilled that they were coming to fight to defend their country. The Germans were terrified of black soldiers, whether from Africa or the United States, so they were considered heroes. And when my book came out, I gave a talk in Baltimore, and I met a guy who had met the last living veteran, World War I veteran in Baltimore, who happened to be African American. And he had interviewed him about what it was like, and all the guy said was it was People were just giving us food. I ate snails. They gave me wine. It was great. People really were nice to the African-American soldiers and to other soldiers too. The U.S. military at the time, a large percentage, a distorted percentage of the officers were from the South, and they were white. So they did not like this at all. And then when African-American soldiers came home, in their uniforms often, because that's all they had, with medals, they'd go back to their small towns, particularly in the South, and they'd be spit on. They'd be, you're acting uppity, what's your problem? They'd be attacked. Several were lynched. I found a letter of a man who had fled to St. Louis who wrote that he had felt safer in the trenches than in Arkansas, which is where he had left. So what was, there was another incident I found where soldiers would be sent home on the railroad, and as soon as they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, they were suddenly sent to the colored car. And there was an incident I found where several white men in a car stood up and objected because these were veterans who had just fought for our country. Why are you kicking them out and sending them back to the colored car? And it became a big argument, and the railroad was very tense about it, and the federal government had to get involved. There were lots of incidents like this popping up all over the place. So it became a point of great tension. Another good thing that was happening for African Americans that year was black farmers, black sharecroppers in the South, sort of the essential downtrodden class in American history, actually did pretty well in 1919. Even despite generally getting ripped off when they tried to take their cotton to be weighed and other kinds of problems, there was such a high demand for cotton that year worldwide because of the war. People needed clothing, the war was over. All these people in Europe needed to have textiles. So cotton prices shot up. So that should be great. Except it led to African Americans were bought more land, they bought cars, they were buying nice clothes, or relatively nice clothes, in a lot of small towns in the South. That led to a lot of tension because the white landowners, white farmers, white bankers, this was all very unsettling to them. So there were incidents in Georgia. I start the book actually in a place called at Carswell Grove Baptist Church, which is a small rural church in Jenkins County, which is south of Augusta. And an incident takes place, and there's a scuffle, and two white police officers at a church who shouldn't have been there are killed. And then white mobs descend on the whole county. And they're burning churches, they're flipping over cars, they're making sure to burn cars, people's homes. And there were letters to the editor in white papers and black papers about this, and it devolved pretty quickly into what are these uppity sharecroppers are now buying, acting above their station. That was basically their complaint, and so this became a real bone of contention. Now the third thing that was generally good for African Americans that year was the Black Migration, the Great Migration. So prior to the World War I, African Americans had started to move north to cities, going up from Mississippi to Chicago, Georgia, up to Cleveland or Detroit. When I worked in Detroit, I would meet people all the time from small towns in Georgia. But during the war, immigration from Europe had stopped. So all these factories needed workers. So that was one, so they started sending guys to the southern towns to try to get workers to come up there. Also, another benefit was a lot of African Americans were not in the unions, partly because they didn't trust the unions, and partly because the unions didn't like black people, a lot of them, so they had good reason to not trust them. So it was a good way to bust the union if you could bring in a bunch of workers, usually for lower wages, bust them in from, truck them in from Mississippi or Tennessee or Kentucky. So that became, generally the Great Migration was very good for African Americans in terms of they made more money. In some cities, they started to have some political power. So Chicago's an example of that. They started to have, they could have better housing, better education. They could build their own communities, where they could have their own doctors, et cetera. But at the same time, they were being penned in. Chicago's a classic example where they were just penned into a small sliver of the South Side. If anyone tried to move out of that, people were leaving bombs on people's doorsteps. That was a big problem just prior to the riots in 1919. People know the term Bommingham. Chicago led the way on that years earlier. So what would be a good thing became, again, another source of tension, another point of friction. And so all these things were roiling around, and I just want to talk a little bit about racism at that time, which is it's somewhat similar to what we have today. But you had your sort of basic Ku Klux Klan racism, and the Klan was in its resurgence. It had started in Atlanta in 1915, the Second Klan, after Colonel Simmons, the brilliant Colonel Simmons, had seen Birth of a Nation over here at the Fox, I think, and then he marched up to Stone Mountain and burned a cross with a couple of his buddies, and they were anti-black, but they were anti-Catholic, they were anti-Jewish, they were anti-immigrant. They had a lot of antis, and they were in massive growth mode, and they were espousing that they were here to defend American civilization. But it was a very simplistic, it was a very lowbrow racism, one that we all know about. At another point, but at the same time, there was this sort of what I'll call highbrow racism among intellectuals. There was an intellectual movement that felt very threatened by immigrants and by the rise, African Americans growing in population. So there was a guy named Lothrop Stoddard at Harvard. He had written a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And he meant that as a bad thing. He didn't mean that as a good thing. He meant that as a bad thing, that white supremacy was how that is civilization to him. And you can look at his books on Google. You can get the PDFs on Google Books. And they will have these elaborate maps of the world in color code. So here's where the Asiatic people live. Here's where the African people are. And that's how he saw the world. I'm going to read a section of his views of his book. Democratic ideals among a homogeneous population of Nordic blood, as in England or America, is one thing, but it is quite another for a white man to share his blood with or entrust his ideals to brown, yellow, black, or red men. This is suicide, pure and simple, and the first victim of this amazing folly will be the white man himself. Now, so that's some, today these are views that are espoused by sort of obscure white-wing groups. This book went into multiple printings. It was by Knopf. It was a very popular book. Lots of people read it. Lots of people embraced it. At that time, there was a little frustrated painter in Austria with a little mustache who really liked it a lot, and he raved about it. And as the Nazis rose to power in Germany, he saw that map and thought of that map as how the world works, that it's organisms of races battling it out. And there was a general view among the Klan, certainly, but also among other white elites that there was something. If we just keep having all these immigrants come in here and African Americans keep having babies, we aren't making enough babies, we're going to lose civilization. Because they equated civilization with white, white control. So all this is roiling around, And then the violence, I start the violence in April. I mean, there were a few incidents prior to that, but April, June, then the summer hits. By July, it really takes off. There's massive riots. There's up to 25 major riots. Millions of people are disrupted by this all across the country. People had their homes burned, businesses destroyed. White and black people were killed. We don't really know exactly how many people were killed because some places, for example, in Chicago, there was a big examination afterward as to what specifically had happened. So we really have a really good idea, thanks to some of the research that was done at the time, about who was killed on what street, what their race was, how old they were, what exactly happened to the best that they could guess. But in places like Arkansas, in rural Arkansas, there was a white military mob basically attacking sharecroppers, and we don't know how many people are dead. People have tried to sort of guess, but it was in the hundreds, but we'll never know. There are people working very hard to try to find where some of those people were buried. There's some interesting work going on now to try to recover some of that history, but certainly the governments were never trying to figure it out at the time. So, all pretty ugly stuff. These riots roll across the country, but something amazing happened that I referenced earlier is fighting back. So I want to talk about the NAACP, which at that time was, up till that point, had been was founded after riots in Springfield, Illinois, by primarily white do-gooders in New York, with a few African Americans with them, including W.E. Du Bois. But that had started to change. And Du Bois had brought on, just prior to the summer of 1919, he had brought on James Weldon Johnson, who, in my opinion, I don't know why there's not, I was just going off on this, but I don't know why there's not statues to him. I don't know why there isn't an amazing biography out about him. I don't know why people don't know more about him, because he's an amazing American who, I will try to sum up his life. He wrote novels, he wrote poems, he was an amazing politician, he was a lawyer, he spoke Spanish, he'd been a diplomat. The guy, he wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, of course, but he also wrote Tin Pan Alley music. The guy was amazing. And he, in his role at the NAACP, starts recruiting insanely and traveling around the country to recruit African American people to join the organization. And when these riots start erupting, it works because people are concerned. They're very frightened about this stuff happening. And he goes through, not just up in the north where he had been, where the organization really had sort of been grounded, but he starts traveling throughout the South because he's from Florida. He'd studied here in Atlanta. So he starts going to small towns, big towns, he'll go everywhere, and people start to join by the tens of thousands. And by the end of the year, there's almost 100,000 people who have joined the organization. And they start petitioning Congress. He's lobbying at the Capitol. He gives a series of hearings with other people at the end of early 2020 about all these issues. And he begins pressing for federal anti-lynching legislation, which ultimately never passes, but it begins this hammering that the federal government has to get involved in these civil rights issues. In the violence against African Americans, you have to have the federal government get involved because the state governments and the local governments just aren't going to do it. Now that's an argument at the time that was utterly discounted and was subsequently discounted, but he laid the groundwork, I believe, for what came later. And when Eisenhower and Kennedy start sending in troops to the South to restore order in various issues, whether it's Arkansas or Alabama, to me that's a direct answer to Johnson. I wish he had been alive when that had happened, because he would have been very happy that it had happened. So Johnson, I'm going to continue to rave about him a little bit more, but he gave all these amazing speeches, and there's one speech that he gave in Boston in which I was reading it and I thought, wow, this sounds a lot like Malcolm X. And then a little bit later, it's like, wow, this sounds like Martin Luther King. Like he was giving these amazing speeches, and we're talking about 1919. So I want to read two quotes from him from that speech. One is regarding self-defense. He said, "I know we can't settle this race trouble by taking a shotgun and going out and shooting up people. But I will say it will go a long way towards settling this thing if we shoot back when we're shot at." That's Malcolm X, right? And on race relations, he said, "We've got to wake up the conscience of the American people, to hold a mirror before the people and let the nation see itself, a sinning nation, for the American spirit is not dead. We need an organization of the white people and the black people to save America from mob violence. Patience is a virtue, but not always. I want to see the Negro patient, but I want to see him fight incessantly for what he believes is his right. No one is more confident than the American Negro, for he knows he is right and has God Almighty on his side, and he can't lose." So, pretty amazing guy, in my opinion. And I thought I'd focus on one riot. I mean, we could go into all the riots, but we'd be here all day. So, but one of the key riots was in Washington, D.C. On July 18th, it started. So all these soldiers were coming back from the war, and there were many forts around Washington, so there were a lot of soldiers and sailors waiting to be decommissioned around Washington, and it was the summer, boiling hot summer, and so lots of sailors milling about, soldiers milling about in the city, looking to get drunk or whatever, and they were, we don't know exactly what happened, but at some point, there had been, the local newspapers, including the Washington Post, had been publishing a bunch of articles about attacks on white women. And these articles were not objective journalism. There was never nobody ever named, and they would use terms like black brute and stuff like that. It was as bad as you'd think it would be. So these have been running to the point where the NAACP had approached these newspapers and said, come on, this isn't objective journalism. Stop, be careful with the words you're using. You could incite some trouble. They were generally ignored. And then at some point on a Friday night on July 18th, a white woman a married white woman who worked at one of the government offices in the city was walking down the street. And two African-American men were coming up to her. Were coming by her, not coming up to her. And was she raped? No. She had an umbrella, and it got jostled somehow. And they exchanged words about it. That's what we know happened. We don't know if the guy bumped into her or she bumped into the guy. We don't know. But that, again, we're talking pre-social media, pre-anything. But rumors were the sort of horrendous Twitter of the day, and that quickly translated into two black guys just raped a white woman, and she's married to a sailor. So every white sailor in the city, we got to pay him back, and they started rioting, and they even announced. There's an article that I found in one of the Washington papers where they said, "Hey, let's meet at the Peace Monument," which is a monument right in front of the. Yeah, I know, that's the irony of that, but. And it's more ironic because the Peace Monument was created after the Civil War to show that our nation had joined together again. It's right in front of the Capitol. So let's meet there and we'll start there. So that's published in the paper. It's almost like an ad. So these guys show up and things quickly spin out of control. Now, one of the complications is Woodrow Wilson, who people... at least when I was a kid, that guy was a hero, and he was intellectual, Democratic president. He was a pretty racist person, and that's been exposed over and over again. But I would put him; he's pretty low down on he's below James Buchanan in my list of good presidents. He's somewhere Quincy Adams or something. I don't know, but he's way down there. So he didn't want to deal with this. He wanted to think of himself as, I'm here to save the world. I'm going to bring peace to the world. I'm an intellectual. I'm above all this. And, but in fact, he was a Southern white intellectual, born and raised in the South, and he had married a woman from Georgia, and he was he had made a lot of promises to African American leaders when he was first elected in the early teens, and then when he got elected, he resegregated the federal bureaucracy. He made a lot of other moves that were considered, that African American leaders were very, very angry with him. And he, there's a lot has been said about his, what he said when he watched Birth of a Nation in the White House. And so a lot has been said about what he said or didn't say there. But he did like the movie, and one of the reasons, if you've ever watched the movie, he liked the movie is because it starts with a quote from one of his history books that he wrote. So of course he liked it, and the general view was, his view of history was that, the period after the Civil War was a horrendous period for the South because carpetbaggers and African Americans who couldn't understand government were suddenly in charge of things, and it was a terrible period, and so you had to have, until the reestablishment of white control, it was really a mess. That was his general view. And that was his general view of government at this point was, if we can't have African Americans have too much power because they just can't handle it. So when this riot erupts, he proves very loudly that apparently white Southern men can't handle it because he does nothing. So the riot erupts. There's gunfire. You can hear it in the White House. It's all over the place. And he does nothing for days and days and days. And the person who's sort of the D.C. commissioner does very little and doesn't really want to act. He tries to have the Washington police handle it, but it's very clear very early that the white police department in Washington, they're just outmanned. They're trying, but they just can't go everywhere at all times. You have, in my earlier reference to fighting back, you had a lot of African American veterans who had come home from the war, and they had been taught how to shoot and to fight. So around Howard University and other places in Washington, they actually set up perimeters, military perimeters on blocks, because people were driving through in cars and just sort of shooting wildly. And then then African Americans set up these perimeters, and they also started to send their own cars around shooting up. So it became basically open warfare for days in Washington. Finally, order was restored, but only after it became so bad. I mean, we're talking about screaming headlines, governments, senators. It looks terrible. The nation that had just defeated the Germans and triumphed in the war and was going to bring democracy to everybody was in chaos. And I'm going to quote, the German, I found Japanese newspapers that were having a field day with this, but a German newspaper, I'm going to quote, this is a translation, obviously. They wrote, under an article entitled "The Black Peril," they wrote, "The disorders now reported are but a beginning. If the Negroes can find a leader, perhaps they already have one. We may yet experience all sorts of things. Perhaps someday a black president." Again, they didn't think that was a good thing. They were terrified of that, but I thought that was funny. But it was finally when order was restored. I mean, one thing I learned in studying all these riots is that once a riot starts to unravel, once the mob starts to gather, you got to get dispassionate troops on street corners right away, pointing guns at people and telling them to go home, because the mob will melt away. And that happened over and over again. But if you don't do that, the mob goes crazy, and they don't stop. They don't stop till everybody's dead. And there were horrific incidents in Omaha and elsewhere where the police melted away, or sometimes joined the mob, or sometimes they just they tried to stop and they were overpowered. But in Washington, in Chicago, in Longview, Texas, and other places, Bisbee, there were examples where African Americans fought back. And this was carried into, this was presented in places like the Chicago Defender, which was really sort of a Southern newspaper. Everybody in the South, every African American in the South would read it, and in other publications. So the word was getting out that you can, the age of just lynching African Americans and getting away with it was over. And a very young man named Gene Toomer, who people may know as a Harlem Renaissance writer, he was 24 at the time. He was unknown, but he wrote an editorial. He wrote a letter to the editorial section of a socialist newspaper in New York, and he wrote, "The outstanding feature remains not that the Negro will fight, but that he will fight against the American white." And that was what terrified a lot of, for a lot of these white people who were adopting the views that I told you about, that the racial map there, this was proof. It's proof. See? But in every one of these instances that I looked at, it was African Americans were the ones being attacked, certainly initially. And so it was sort of this weird self-fulfilling prophecy where it was just roiling and roiling and roiling, and everyone's terrified. And it was often the white newspapers, unfortunately, were biased, and they would report, somehow that it was believed that Negroes were, that there were communist agitators leading them to do this, even though particularly in Omaha, they were saying that it was the IWW had organized the African American community to riot, but that's not what happened. I mean, the facts are, I've looked at the court record. What happened is that a man was accused of raping a white woman, and the mob wanted to kill him. So they broke into the courthouse and destroyed the courthouse, and he was killed in public. Now, there were numerous examples of that throughout 1919, numerous lynchings. And James Weldon Johnson argued over and over again that the issue isn't, in some of these cases, maybe the people were guilty, maybe they weren't. But we'll never know because you've killed the person. They were not given due process. And due process became one of the key issues that the NAACP and other organizations really started to argue that because of numerous incidents in 1919. And they really, it became a focal point, and I argue, the importance of James Weldon Johnson and the NAACP's arguments that year were really, we're Americans too. So you don't like us? Hey, that's your thing. But we get the same rights as you under the Constitution of the United States of America because we're American citizens. And that was what they repeatedly asserted. And that, as everyone knows in this room, was a long argument that people are still arguing about today, but it was made very loudly that year, and I think it began a process to where we finally got to the 1960s, and finally things changed with many issues unresolved, of course. All right, so so I would 1919 I would compare, like if you're going to compare it to the American Revolution, I'd compare it to like Lexington and Concord, not Yorktown. It's like this is the beginning of this long process, but it was a beginning, an important beginning. And I want to I'll end with two quotes. One, there was a little Jewish guy named Herbert Seligman who joined the NAACP, and he did stuff that was crazy. They would send him in after there was a lynching into the town to gather information, to write a report about what had happened. So he would go in pretending to be just an average guy, even though he was in New York. I don't know how he did on Southern accents, but he was from New York, but he would sort of, cozy up to people at the barbershop or whatever and try to get them to tell him stuff. And other people in the NAACP would do that as well. And he wrote a book afterwards about what had happened. And he wrote in that book, race relations constitute democracy's most essential problem, a problem compounded of all other adjustments which free men are called on to make, excuse the sexism, it was 1919, in forming and maintaining social relations. Shameful as it was, the year 1919, with bloodshed, lynching, and race riot in the United States, the function was still to bring before the nation a big national problem, long unresolved, that it demanded serious attention. So he was saying, like, here, this race relations, this is where we are. We have to get somewhere better than this. And there was a British journalist who traveled around the South in 1919 and wrote a book about it. And at one point, he was in Shady Dale, Georgia. I don't know if anybody's been to Shady Dale. You don't have to go there. It's all right. I've been there. It's a little town, and it's not doing so great. But he met a white woman there, and he asked her about what's happening in America and what does she think of race relations. And she said, "There's no managing the niggas now," and he spelled it Neegahs. "They got so biggity since the war." And I read that quote and I thought, that's perfect, because she's right. What the war taught African Americans was they're not going to go back into the box that they were put in. So, and whether it was people moving in the Great Migration, or people, sharecroppers in the South, or veterans who've returned from the war, they weren't going to get pushed back into the roles that a lot of people wanted them to be in. And to me, that was a pivotal moment in changing American history. And so the NAACP, at the beginning, it had 43,000 members at the beginning of 1919. By the end of 1919, it had 91,000 members. That's just one stat. But I mean, everybody was reading their publication, and it was a transformative period. Anyways, that's my talk. Any questions? I'd be glad.